Viktor Alexeyevich, in the title of our program, you have included the question of one of the Western correspondents, which was once voiced in Davos. Who is Mr. Putin? Could you, anticipating our conversation about Putin, comment on the very fact that this question has arisen and remains relevant?
You rightly noted that for the mass media today, this question is no less relevant than immediately after Vladimir Putin had come into the leadership of the country. The principles of governance implemented by our sovereign, Vladimir Putin, can be in no way linked up with any of the primitive templates that have been worked out within decades. The left, the right, those for the market and planned economy, the red, the white, anti-communists, Marxists. At the same time, in the imposed political spectrum, he is equidistant, not only, say, from the pseudo-patriotic wing and from the allegedly opposing wing of the Union of Right Forces, but also from the so-called political center, despite the attempts of the center to portray its closeness with the president. It is this circumstance that makes our sovereign a mystery for both Western and domestic political technologists. For us, this circumstance is direct evidence that it was not possible to fit our president into the biblical conception of governance imposed on our society. Indeed, from a different standpoint, from the standpoint of the conception of social safety, dead water, the left, the right, and the center represent a single team, and each of the parties plays its own violin in a single orchestra of the biblical, Euro-American, conceptual center of governance. It seems that Vladimir Putin managed to rise above this party kaleidoscope in favor of a single party, the multi-million people of our country. Judging by the mass media, both Russian and Western, the attitude towards Vladimir Putin is cautiously negative. On this occasion, perhaps for the first time, the voices of both the pro-Western democratic mass media and those openly opposed to the current regime have harmoniously merged into a single chorus. Berezovsky's direct alliance with Prokhanov is based on the principle of friendship against Putin. In our opinion, it is precisely this elite unanimity that is evidence that this time the majority of ordinary people who voted for Vladimir Putin was not mistaken in their choice. During the reign of Vladimir Putin, lone interest as the main parameter of global supranational governance has decreased 8 times and now stands at 21% per annum. Further steps in this direction seem to be strongly opposed.
Vladimir Putin really stands somehow apart from the current elite. What do you think it is connected with?
The fact is that the victorious Vladimir Putin, unlike his disgraced competitors, comes from a family of laboring ordinary people. In Soviet times, he did not belong to any elite corporation, the heirs and successors of which are the present, essentially unified so-called democratic and patriotic elites, and their leaders, who are equally opposed to the people while satisfying their own selfish corporate interests. The KGB is not a corporation, but a thankless job to ensure the safety of the life of the people in the state, which is sometimes combined with ensuring the safety of certain clans and elite groupings. A person who has taken shape within this or that social group, and this is a period of life up to 15 to 20 years, forever retains a basic devotion to this social group. And Vladimir Putin will not be an exception in this regard, as much as it may sadden many of the elitarian circles.
How would you evaluate the current attitude towards Vladimir Putin in the country?
I think that we have a completely non-standard situation. Just recall Yeltsin. All views on him, his rating, were conditioned exclusively by PR campaigns and television promotion. As for Vladimir Putin, despite the purpose-oriented persecution, his rating among ordinary people and in foreign public opinion is steadily growing. They have begun to talk about him as the true leader of the 21st century. This is a consequence of the fact that the first serious decisions of Vladimir Putin are not of a puppet character, but of an autocratic, conceptually significant character. It is primarily about bringing common sense into the territorial structure of Russia, into the formation of the vertical of power. From a conceptual point of view, the intrastate territorial division on a national basis, characteristic of the Marxist-Leninist past, is nothing more than a trap, a time bomb, and the number of subordinates of the first level in the optimal version should be 7 to 9 people, but not 89, as that was until recently. Changes in these issues turn Vladimir Putin from the head of the Kremlin into the leader of the state. The significance, openness and clarity of the decisions made lead Vladimir Putin up to the level of the head of the global supranational level of governance, standing above the current, conceptually non-independent Western P-residents. This enables him to carry out a fundamentally new independent external politics, which ultimately should be a continuation of internal politics. After all, the secret of the once undisputable superiority of J.V. Stalin over foreign colleagues was also conditioned by his measure of understanding of the principles of global governance. It is only this understanding that is capable of ensuring the invulnerability of Vladimir Putin, his defense against attacks, from whatever position they are organized.
When you talk about Vladimir Putin as a global-level politician, how can this be correlated with NATO's eastward movement?
Many actions of Vladimir Putin have a very deep conceptual significance and are not understandable, not only to you, but also to those around him. NATO is nothing more than a stick in the hands of its owner. You've probably seen a situation where a dog pounces on a long stick with which someone is trying to take the bone out of his bowl. Many would like to lower the measure of understanding of our sovereign to their own level. It is possible that the algorithmics of some of his actions form from the unconscious levels of his psyche under the influence of wrestling skills. After all, there is a big difference between the Western skills of confrontation and the Eastern ones. If your opponent caught you in a mistake, then in Eastern practice, you should not resist force by force, as in Greco-Roman wrestling, but succumb to the vector of impact, and, resisting, bend in the same direction to which your opponent tries to bend you, however, getting him away from the direction in which he can achieve his objectives. In international politics, Vladimir Putin is demonstrating these skills. All newspapers, both right-wing and left-wing, are shouting about the further surrender of Russia's positions under pressure from the West. The collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, was a tragedy for the ordinary laborers of all nationalities in our country, which is not the case with the national elites of the former USSR. But no one has yet tried to evaluate what the West is gaining with the inclusion in its sphere of influence not only of the national elites of the former countries of the socialist camp, but also of ordinary laborers. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, which appeared during the existence of the Soviet Union, there is a section, Theory of Supersystems. There it is said that when a bloc, which is the Russian civilization, collides with a conglomerate, which is the Western regional civilization, at the initial stages, the conglomerate absorbs, together with the debris of the collapsed bloc, its potential vector of objectives and the vector of error. Blocs and conglomerates are characterized by fundamentally different, prevailing in them, styles of governance towards the affairs of society. Discernment of the objective vector of objectives of the bloc is a problem even for the leadership of the bloc itself, to say nothing of the leadership of the conglomerate. This is because the bloc does not have a localized center of governance. V.O. Kluchevsky, in one of his aphorisms about this feature of governance of Russia, said, "Our center is on the periphery." As a result, having absorbed the fragments of the bloc, the conglomerate turns out to be infected with an egregorial virus, the unlocalized algorithmics of governance towards the bloc. And there are no guarantees that its cultural potential will be enough to identify, correctly comprehend, and suppress the algorithmics of the bloc governance. According to the theory of interaction between blocs and conglomerates in supersystems, and the general Eastern principle of succumbing to the opponent, deflecting him to failure, NATO, expanding more and more, becomes an increasingly less governable system. And although this organization puts pressure with the mass of its members, the quality of governance towards this mass becomes lower than that which this organization had when it included 16 but not 26 countries. So NATO enlargement is more of a problem for the NATO organization itself, but not for Russia. In the presence of deterrence systems, in particular nuclear weapons, it is at least unreasonable to focus on the sixth priority of generalized means of governance, generalized weaponry, in the confrontation between the two systems. It is necessary to conduct an offensive on all six priorities of generalized means, and above all, on the first, methodological priority. This is a guarantee of the irreversibility of the results achieved. This is the logic of Vladimir Putin's actions. We must not forget that the Soviet Union was destroyed without a single shot from NATO, its then potential enemy.
Maybe you have your own explanation about the compromising position of Vladimir Putin in relation to the non-human aggressive aspirations of the US military machine.
First of all, I would like to remind you about one of the most ancient wisdoms, which unfortunately was not in demand by our foreign politics before. Keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. Because how else can you find out and prevent their intentions? This wisdom is fully implemented in the foreign politics of Vladimir Putin. Look from these positions at his friendship with Bush. After the USSR freed the place of the so-called evil empire, it was immediately occupied by the United States, which declared the whole world a zone of its national interests. Counteracting this puppet regime is a thankless task. It is better to not interfere with the internal split of the aggressor conglomerate. The USSR played the role of a scarecrow for the Western countries. It scared them and united them. Having lost this unifying principle, the West suddenly discovered that Europe and the United States have their own interests, and their vectors of objectives do not coincide, both in the composition of objectives and in their priorities. And the contradictions in the Western conglomerate exist not only on the sixth priority of generalized means of governance, conventional types of armed confrontation, but are clearly visible on the fourth, financial, and third, ideology, technology, priorities. So, when making decisions about the start of military operations against Iraq, France and Germany took a position different from that of the USA. This was immediately reflected in the financial sphere. Some of the Arabic countries withdrew from the US economy investments in the amount of $500 billion and transferred them to the French economy. And the Schröder government, in order to win the elections, did not disdain in its electoral program to use the likeness of President Bush to Hitler. Many politicians of Russia of the patriotic persuasion, remaining captive to the stereotypes of biblical conception, of confrontation between different powers, quite sincerely believe that President Putin is acting outside the stream of sequential internal and external politics which expresses the interests of the peoples of Russia, directly declaring that he is another puppet of the world behind the scenes, or of the United States, placed at the head of Russia. In particular, it is Colonel General L.G. Ivashov, Vice President of the Academy of Geopolitical Sciences. His interview with the reporter of the magazine Russian Sunday, Galina Kuskova, was titled, "Putin is not coping with his duties as the head of state." But so-called patriots of this kind, scrupulously examining internal and external politics, apparently do not understand that in addition to internal and external politics, there also exists global politics, aimed at achieving objectives in relation to the entire global civilization, humanity as a whole. The world behind the scenes is developing the United States as a world gendarme, and our pseudo-patriots see the world as an arena for confrontation with the United States, relying on the forces. Contrary to the opinion of all such patriots, in this general political background, it is important that Russia today is not in conflict with anyone. Herewith, it does not matter whether Putin carries out this political course because he has mastered the sufficiently general theory of governance and is able to apply it in practice without explaining anything extra to anyone, or whether he is guided from above and is the carrier of a new methodological culture. It is important that in his activities he does not make big mistakes, and, with a shortage of cadres whose professional and obvious ethical qualities would be formed on the basis of the conception of social safety, such activity of the President provides our social initiative with the opportunity to form a new cadre base in conditions of calm life in our society. This is the main thing, and this opportunity should be 100% used.
The mass media is constantly trying to draw some parallels between Putin and Stalin. What do you think of it?
Before expressing my attitude to these comparisons, I should note that the meaning of J.V. Stalin's life and activity is presented today in a completely distorted form. I would not like to get into this topic right now. I think we could devote our next program to it. Let's name it, "The Time Has Come, I Begin the Story of Stalin." Since I perceive Stalin in a completely different way, such comparisons do not scare me. And their authors, whether they like it or not, indicate the fact that over the past couple of centuries, only two leaders, Vladimir Putin and J.V. Stalin, came to an understanding of the global supranational schemes of governance towards humanity, to an understanding of conceptual power. The difference is that Stalin governed in an autocratic way, without looking back at the world behind the scenes, in the absence of his own conceptions set out in words, in vocabulary, on paper. He acted according to purpose consonance, but the system of structureless governance in line with this purpose consonance was absent due to the non-announcement of the conception. Under these conditions, he could only build an alternative conception opposed to the biblical one. Vladimir Putin has an opportunity to rely on the structureless system of governance carried out on the basis of the conception of social safety, dead water, announced in society, and to work in line with the alternative encompassing conception. And this is fundamentally different algorithmics. The principles of who will beat whom are alien to it. We must build our global plans in order that the vector of objectives of the systems opposing us, in our conception, would undergo a transformation into the vector of error of governance. In the Western systems of initiation, this is called the effect of the monkey's paw. In Russian, it is called what we fought for, we ran into it. It is in this situation that both the United States and NATO are now. The more diligently they play the role of the world gendarme, the more of their own problems they will have. J.V. Stalin worked in the algorithmics of confrontation, and he failed to prevent the global massacre. Vladimir Putin, at the present stage, managed to egress from the confrontation triangle, USA, Russia, China. Europe is now actively taking Russia's place. Russia has risen in terms of worldview above this confrontation, and the locomotive of global history of humanity is already going along her way.